Power without accountability always sounds the same, sharp, certain, and already convinced it is right. The red and blue lights cut through my mirrors before I even heard the siren, washing the asphalt behind me in pulses that felt louder than sound, like a heartbeat I did not ask for. I eased off the throttle, the engine beneath me dropping from a steady growl to a low, reluctant hum, and guided the bike onto the shoulder of the highway where the wind carried the smell of hot rubber and distant rain. 70 miles per hour had felt like freedom a moment ago, the open stretch of road just outside Phoenix stretching ahead in long, sunburned lines, but now everything narrowed into a single point behind me, flashing, approaching, inevitable. I kept both hands visible as I shut the engine off, the silence that followed almost too clean, like the world had taken a breath and decided to hold it. Boots on gravel. Radio static. A door closing harder than it needed to. I did not turn around right away. I did not need to. I have learned to recognize the rhythm of these moments, the way they build before a single word is spoken. It is never just a stop. It is a question already answered. It is a story already written. I swung my leg off the bike slowly, letting the heat from the engine brush against my calf, grounding me, reminding me that I was still here, still in control of something, even if it was only the way I moved. The helmet came off last. Warm air touched my face, carrying dust and sunlight and the faint scent of gasoline, and I placed it carefully on the seat like it mattered, like small acts of care could anchor a situation that was already slipping somewhere else. Footsteps approached from behind, measured, deliberate, the kind that carried authority even before the voice did. "Step away from the vehicle," he said, not loud, not rushed, just certain, like the outcome of this moment had already been decided somewhere far away from me. I took 2 steps back, hands still open at my sides, palms visible, fingers relaxed, every movement intentional, every breath counted. There is a difference between being calm and being practiced, and I had spent years learning how to make the two look identical. The highway stretched on in both directions, cars rushing past in blurred streaks of motion, none of them slowing, none of them stopping, because this was not their moment, this was mine, and it felt smaller than it should have, like the world had shrunk to the space between me and the man now standing just behind my shoulder. I could feel his eyes before I met them, that quick assessment that happens in a fraction of a second, clothing, posture, skin, conclusions forming faster than facts. "License and registration," he said, and I nodded once, slow, controlled, turning just enough to reach into my jacket without making it look like a reach at all. The leather creaked softly as I moved, a small, ordinary sound that felt too loud in the quiet space between us. I handed over my license without a word. He looked at it, then at me, then back again, and I saw it, that flicker, that hesitation that was not really hesitation, just recalibration, like something did not match the picture he had already decided on. I had seen that look before, more times than I could count, in different cities, on different streets, under different lights, but it always carried the same weight. It always asked the same silent question. And it never waited for an answer. The second officer stayed closer to the cruiser, one hand resting near his radio, watching, not speaking, his presence filling the edges of the moment like a shadow that did not need a voice. The first officer stepped a little closer, just enough to narrow the space between us, and for a second, the heat from the pavement rose around us, shimmering in the afternoon sun, bending the air, making everything feel slightly unreal. "Is this your bike?" he asked, and there it was, exactly where I knew it would be, not the first question, not the last, but always the one that mattered more than it should. I held his gaze steady, level, not challenging, not yielding, just present. There are 100 ways to answer a question like that, and I knew all of them. I knew how to end this in 5 seconds. I knew how to shift the balance with a single sentence. But I also knew something else, something heavier, something quieter. I knew that sometimes the truth is not what people are asking for. Sometimes they are asking for confirmation of what they already believe. I took a slow breath, feeling it settle deep in my chest, grounding me, steadying me, and for a moment, the world narrowed again, not to the flashing lights, not to the officers, but to the space inside my own head where I could still choose how this would unfold. "Am I being detained?" I asked, my voice even, controlled, carrying none of the weight I felt pressing against my ribs. The wind picked up slightly, brushing past us, lifting the edge of my jacket, carrying dust across the shoulder of the road, and for a second, no one moved. No one spoke. And in that silence, I felt it again, that familiar shift, that subtle tightening in the air when power is questioned, even gently, even respectfully. If this moment feels familiar, if it settles somewhere deep in your chest like you have lived it before or watched it happen from the outside looking in, then you already understand more than words can explain, because some stories do not start with what is said, they start with what is assumed. And right now, standing on the side of a sunburned highway with 2 officers and a silent line of passing cars, I could feel the weight of that assumption settling in, quiet, heavy, and waiting to see what I would do next. The question hung there for a fraction longer than it should have, and I watched it land, not just on his ears but somewhere deeper, somewhere that made his posture shift almost imperceptibly, like the ground beneath him had tilted by half a degree and he was deciding whether to correct his balance or pretend nothing had changed. He did not answer me right away, and that silence said more than any response could have, stretching thin between us, pulling tight against the edges of control he thought he still held. A car rushed past behind him, the wind it carried tugging at his uniform, fluttering the edge of his sleeve, and for a moment the scene felt almost staged, like something I had seen before from the outside looking in, except this time I was standing in the center of it. "I asked you a question," he said finally, his tone firmer now, not louder, just reinforced, like he was rebuilding the authority he felt had been nudged out of place. "Is this your bike?" I let the moment breathe before I answered, not because I did not know what to say, but because I knew exactly how this part always unfolded. There is a rhythm to it, a sequence, a pattern that does not change no matter the city, no matter the badge, no matter the road. The assumption comes first. Then the doubt. Then the demand for proof. I nodded once, slow and deliberate. "Yes," I said, keeping my voice level, giving him nothing extra to hold on to, nothing to push against. His eyes moved over the bike again, tracing the clean lines of the frame, the custom detailing, the kind of machine that turns heads even when it is standing still, and I could almost hear the calculation happening behind his expression, the quiet question of ownership clashing with the picture he had already formed. "Step further back," he said, and this time it was less of a request, more of a boundary being drawn, even if it was only a few inches of gravel between my boots and the edge of the shoulder. I took another step, feeling the loose stones shift beneath my feet, grounding myself in the small, physical reality of the moment, because everything else felt like it was balancing on something less stable. The second officer moved closer now, not rushed, just adjusting his position, narrowing the space again, tightening the frame around me without saying a word. I could feel the attention from passing cars, the brief glances, the slowed heads turning just enough to catch a glimpse before moving on, each one a silent witness that would never stay long enough to understand what was actually happening. "Do you have any weapons on you?" the first officer asked, and the question came out smoother than the others, practiced, routine, but still carrying that same underlying weight, that same assumption dressed in procedure. "No," I replied, meeting his eyes again, steady, unshaken, because this part was not new to me, not even close. He nodded once, but it was not agreement, it was acknowledgement of the script moving forward, and I saw his hand shift slightly toward his radio, not touching it, just close enough to remind me it was there. "Turn around," he said, and the words landed heavier than the ones before, not because of what they meant, but because of what they signaled, that quiet step from questioning into something more controlled, more confined. I hesitated for just a second, not enough to challenge him, just enough to feel the weight of the choice before I made it, because even now, even here, I still had choices, even if they were small ones. I turned slowly, the heat from the sun pressing against my back, the sound of traffic blurring into a constant, distant rush, and I placed my hands where he could see them without being told, fingers spread slightly, shoulders relaxed, every movement intentional, every motion measured. The air felt different facing away from him, thinner somehow, like I had stepped into a space where I could not see what was coming next, only feel it building behind me. If you have ever stood in a moment where you knew what was about to happen before it happened, where your body understood the pattern even if your mind wanted to believe this time might be different, then you know this feeling, that quiet tightening in your chest, that steadying of your breath, that decision to hold your ground even when the ground does not feel entirely yours. The gravel shifted again as he stepped closer, and I felt the presence behind me without needing to turn, felt the space close and just enough to remind me that this was no longer just a stop on the side of the road, it was something else now, something heavier, something that would leave a mark even if no one else could see it. And in that moment, standing still under the wide, open sky with nothing but asphalt stretching in both directions, I realized that this was not about the bike, or the speed, or even the stop itself. It was about something quieter, something older, something that had been repeating itself long before I ever turned the ignition key, and as the seconds stretched out behind me, I could feel that pattern settling in again, waiting to see if I would follow it or change it. If you have ever been in a moment like this, where silence speaks louder than words and every second feels like a decision, then say where you are watching from, because stories like this do not belong to just one place, they travel, they repeat. And sometimes, they change. The metal clicked around my wrists with a clean, final sound, not loud, not dramatic, just precise, like a decision being locked into place, and for a brief second everything else seemed to fall quiet around it, even the traffic, even the wind, as if the world itself had paused to acknowledge what had just shifted. I did not resist, did not pull away, did not give them anything that could be mistaken for escalation, because I understood the difference between control and reaction, and right now control was the only thing I still owned. The officer adjusted his grip, not rough, not gentle, just firm enough to remind me of the boundary he believed he had established, and I felt the weight of his certainty more than the pressure of the cuffs themselves. "You are being detained," he said, his voice measured, official, the kind of tone that does not ask for agreement, only compliance. I nodded slightly, more to myself than to him, acknowledging the moment for what it was, not what it should have been. The sun pressed down harder now, heat rising from the pavement in slow waves that blurred the edges of everything, turning the horizon into something soft and distant, like it belonged to another place entirely. A car slowed as it passed, just enough for the driver to look, to take in the scene, to form a quick opinion before accelerating again and disappearing into the flow of the highway, carrying that version of the story with them. I stood still, hands secured behind me, shoulders squared, breathing steady, because stillness can say more than movement ever could. The second officer stepped closer, his presence now fully inside the space that had once been mine, and I could feel the shift again, that tightening of control, that quiet reinforcement of authority that did not need to be spoken out loud. "We are going to figure out what is going on here," he said, and the words were almost casual, almost routine, but they carried an assumption that had already taken root, something that did not need evidence to exist. I let the sentence pass through me without reacting, without absorbing it, because I knew better than to carry something that was never mine to begin with. My eyes moved to the bike for a moment, still resting on the shoulder where I had left it, the engine ticking softly as it cooled, a faint reminder of motion, of freedom, of a version of the moment that had already slipped away. I thought about how quickly things change, how a road can go from open to closed in the span of a few seconds, how a decision made by someone else can redraw the lines of your reality without asking permission. "Do you understand why you were stopped?" the first officer asked, and I could hear it now, the shift in his tone, not uncertainty, but reinforcement, like he needed the answer to match the version of events he had already built in his mind. I took a slow breath, feeling it settle deep, grounding me again, reminding me that I was still here, still present, still capable of choosing how I moved through this. "You tell me," I replied, my voice even, controlled, not defiant, not submissive, just steady, because sometimes the most powerful thing you can do is refuse to fill in the blanks someone else has created for you. There was a pause, brief but noticeable, and I could feel it ripple through the space between us, like a small disturbance in still water. He did not like that answer, not because it was wrong, but because it did not follow the script he expected. His jaw tightened slightly, just enough for me to notice, just enough to confirm what I already knew. The second officer shifted his weight, gravel crunching under his boots, and the radio at his shoulder crackled faintly with distant voices, fragments of other moments, other stops, other stories unfolding somewhere else. For a second, I wondered how many of those stories sounded like this one, how many began with the same assumption, the same quiet certainty, the same need to confirm what had already been decided. The officer holding my license glanced at it again, longer this time, his eyes moving across the details, then back to me, and I saw it again, that flicker, that moment where something did not align, where the reality in his hand did not fully match the image in his mind. It was small, almost invisible, but it was there, and I recognized it because I had seen it before, that first crack in certainty, that first hint that the story might not end the way it was expected to. He stepped back half a pace, not enough to release control, just enough to create space for thought, and in that space, I felt the shift begin, subtle, incomplete, but real. I stood there, hands still secured, posture unchanged, letting the moment unfold without forcing it, because some truths do not need to be spoken immediately, they reveal themselves in the silence, in the hesitation, in the space between what is assumed and what is real, and as the heat shimmered off the pavement and the sound of the highway carried on without us, I knew we were standing right at the edge of that shift. That turning point where everything could change, not with noise, not with force, but with the quiet weight of something undeniable waiting just beneath the surface. The air shifted in a way that was almost imperceptible, like the moment before a storm decides whether it will break or pass, and I could feel it in the way the officer held my license just a fraction longer than necessary, his thumb pressing against the edge as if the plastic itself might confirm what his instincts could not. The radio on his shoulder crackled again, a distant voice calling out something unrelated, something ordinary, but it sounded louder now, cutting through the silence that had settled between us. He turned slightly toward his partner, not fully, just enough to share a glance that carried more meaning than words, a silent exchange that asked a question neither of them wanted to say out loud. "Run it again," the second officer muttered, low enough that it might have been missed by anyone not standing exactly where I was, but I heard it, clear and precise, and I felt the shift deepen, that subtle movement from certainty into uncertainty, from control into hesitation. The first officer nodded once, stepping back toward the cruiser, the gravel crunching under his boots as he moved, creating space that had not existed before, a gap in the structure of the moment that let something new slip in. I remained where I was, hands still secured behind me, posture steady, breathing even, because nothing had changed yet, not officially, not in a way that could be named, but something had begun to move beneath the surface, something that could not be ignored much longer. The second officer stayed with me. His presence still firm, still controlled, but different now, less certain, like he was holding a position he was no longer completely confident in. "You ride this thing often?" he asked, and the question felt out of place, almost casual, like he was trying to fill the silence with something safer, something that did not require him to confront what was unfolding just a few feet away. "Often enough," I replied, my voice calm, neutral, giving him nothing more than the answer itself, because I understood what he was doing, and I understood why. People reach for normal when something feels like it might not be. The cruiser door opened, then closed, and I heard the faint beeping of the onboard system, the soft clicks of keys being pressed, the quiet mechanics of verification, of systems catching up to reality. Seconds stretched, longer than they should have, longer than they needed to, and in that stretch I felt the weight of every assumption that had led us here, every unspoken conclusion that had been made before a single question was asked. The highway continued to move around us, cars passing, engines humming, lives continuing without interruption, and it struck me how small this moment was in the scale of everything else, and yet how large it felt standing inside it. The first officer stepped out of the cruiser again, slower this time, his movements less rigid, less certain, and as he approached I could see it clearly now, that shift in his expression, not fully formed, not yet acknowledged, but undeniable. He looked at me, then at the cuffs, then back at me again, and for the first time since the lights had come on behind me, there was a question in his eyes that had not been there before. Not suspicion. Not assumption. A question. He stopped a few feet away, holding my license differently now, not as evidence, not as leverage, but as something that required interpretation, and for a moment he said nothing, the silence returning, heavier this time, filled with the weight of what he was beginning to understand. The second officer straightened slightly, sensing it too, that shift, that quiet unraveling of the narrative they had stepped into with such certainty just minutes ago. "Is there anything else you want to tell us?" the first officer asked, and the words were different now, not a demand, not a challenge, but something closer to an opening, a space being offered where before there had only been direction. I held his gaze steady, unchanged, because my position had not shifted, even if his had. "Everything you need is already in your hand," I said, my voice even, carrying no edge, no urgency, just truth, simple and complete. He looked down at the license again, longer this time, and I could see the moment it clicked, not loud, not dramatic, just a quiet alignment of information and reality that could no longer be ignored. His jaw tightened, then loosened, his shoulders shifting slightly as if the weight he had been carrying had suddenly changed shape, become something less solid, less certain. The wind moved through again, lifting dust from the shoulder of the road, carrying it across the space between us, soft and temporary, like the last trace of something that was about to disappear. And in that moment, standing there under the wide, open sky with the heat rising from the pavement and the sound of the highway continuing without pause, I knew we had crossed it, that invisible line between assumption and recognition, and even though nothing had been said yet, not fully, not clearly, everything had already begun to change. The realization did not arrive like a loud interruption or a sudden break in the moment, it came quietly, settling into the space between us like something undeniable that had been waiting to be seen, and I watched it move across his face in small, controlled shifts, the tightening of his jaw easing, the rigid line of his shoulders softening just enough to betray what he had not yet said. He looked at the license again, then at me, and this time there was no comparison happening, no attempt to reconcile two conflicting images, because the conflict had already resolved itself. The truth was no longer competing with assumption. It had replaced it. The second officer took a half step back, subtle but clear, as if the ground he had been standing on no longer felt as solid as it had a few moments ago, and the space around me began to open in a way that felt almost unfamiliar, like air returning to a room that had been sealed. "Dispatch confirmed," the first officer said, his voice lower now, stripped of the sharp certainty it carried before, and though the words were simple, they carried weight, the kind that changes the direction of everything without raising its volume. He exhaled slowly, not dramatically, just enough for me to notice, and then his eyes dropped briefly to the cuffs around my wrists before lifting again, and in that brief movement I saw it, not just recognition, but something closer to reflection, the moment where a person becomes aware of the line they have crossed without realizing it at the time. He stepped closer, but this time the distance felt different, not closing in, not controlling, just approaching, and when he spoke again, the words were measured in a way they had not been before. "We are going to remove these," he said, and it was not an order, not even a request, just a statement that acknowledged what should have been obvious from the beginning. The metal shifted as he reached for the cuffs, the click this time softer, almost careful, and when they released, the pressure around my wrists disappeared instantly, but the imprint of the moment remained, not physical, not visible, but present in a way that could not be undone by a simple motion. I brought my hands forward slowly, not rushing, not reacting, just moving with the same control I had held onto from the start, flexing my fingers slightly as circulation returned, grounding myself again in the present. The second officer avoided my eyes for a moment, his attention drifting toward the highway, toward anything that did not require him to engage directly with what had just unfolded, and I understood that too, the instinct to look away when something does not align with who you believe yourself to be. The first officer cleared his throat, a small, human sound that broke the last layer of distance between us, and when he spoke again, the words were different, not rehearsed, not procedural, just real. "There was a misunderstanding," he said, and the sentence hung there, incomplete in a way that did not need to be filled in, because we both knew what it meant and what it did not say. I met his gaze, steady, unchanged, because my position in this moment had not shifted, even if his had, and I let the silence stretch just long enough for the weight of it to settle where it needed to. The wind moved through again, softer now, carrying the faint scent of asphalt and sun, and the bike behind me ticked quietly as it cooled, a reminder of motion waiting to be resumed. "Am I free to go?" I asked, my voice calm, even, the same as it had been from the beginning, because the question was not new, only the answer had changed. He nodded once, immediate, no hesitation this time, and stepped back, creating space not just physically, but in a way that acknowledged the shift that had taken place. "Yes," he said, and the word carried more than permission, it carried the end of something that should never have begun. I turned slightly, rolling my shoulders once, letting the tension I had held in place settle and release in a controlled way, and walked back toward the bike without hurry, without looking back, because there was nothing behind me that needed my attention anymore. The sun stretched across the road in long, bright lines, the highway still moving, still constant, still indifferent to what had just happened on its edge, and as I reached for my helmet, feeling its familiar weight in my hands, I understood something that had been clear long before this moment but felt sharper now, more defined, that sometimes the shift is not in the power itself, but in who is forced to recognize it. And standing there with the engine cooling beside me and the sound of traffic carrying on without pause, I knew that recognition had already happened, whether it was spoken out loud or not. The helmet felt heavier in my hands than it had a few minutes ago, not because its weight had changed, but because everything around it had, and I stood there for a second longer than necessary, fingers resting along its edge, feeling the faint warmth it had held from the ride, grounding myself in something simple, something familiar. The highway stretched out in front of me again, open, unchanged, as if nothing had happened, as if the last several minutes had not folded themselves into a moment that would stay with me long after the engine started again. I placed the helmet back on slowly, the soft click of the straps settling under my chin, the world narrowing slightly as the visor came down, filtering the light into something calmer, something more contained. Behind me, I could still feel their presence, not as pressure anymore, not as control, but as something quieter, something uncertain, like they were standing in the aftermath of a moment they had not fully expected to face. The engine came to life beneath me with a low, steady vibration, familiar and constant, and for a second I let my hands rest on the grips without moving, feeling the machine respond to me, not question me, not evaluate me, just respond. There is something honest about that kind of response, something clean, something that does not require explanation. I adjusted my position slightly, boots firm against the pavement, and glanced once in the mirror, not to look at them directly, but to acknowledge the space we had just shared, the shift that had taken place whether either of us chose to name it or not. The first officer stood a few feet back now, posture less rigid, his hands no longer positioned for control but resting at his sides, and even through the reflection I could see it, that lingering awareness, that quiet recalculation that comes after certainty has been challenged and replaced with something else. The second officer remained near the cruiser, his gaze moving between the road and the ground, avoiding the mirror, avoiding the moment, as if distance could soften what had already happened. I did not wait for anything else, did not look for words that might or might not come, because some moments do not need closure in the way people expect, they carry their own kind of ending, quiet and complete. I eased the bike forward, the tires rolling over gravel before finding the smooth line of asphalt, and as the speed began to build again, the wind returned, rushing past me, filling the space that had been held still, carrying away the last traces of the moment behind me. 60 miles per hour came easily, then 70, the engine steady beneath me, the road opening up once more, and yet something inside me remained still, not stuck, not held back, just aware. There is a difference between leaving a place and carrying it with you, and I could feel that difference settling in as the miles stretched out ahead. The sky above was wide and clear, the kind of blue that feels endless, and the desert landscape rolled out on either side, dry and open, unchanged by what had happened on its edge. But I was not unchanged. Not in a way that broke me, not in a way that slowed me down, but in a way that sharpened something I already knew, something I had learned long before today and would carry long after. I thought about the moment the cuffs closed, the moment the assumption took shape, the moment it shifted, and the moment it ended, each one distinct, each one connected, like steps in a pattern that repeats until someone sees it clearly enough to name it. The road curved slightly ahead, and I leaned into it, smooth, controlled, the bike responding without hesitation, and for a second everything aligned again, motion, balance, control, all of it working together without conflict. That is what freedom feels like, not the absence of obstacles, but the presence of control within them, the ability to move forward even when the path is interrupted, even when the ground shifts beneath you. The wind pressed against me, steady and constant, and I let it carry the last of the tension away, not erasing the moment, but placing it where it belonged, behind me, part of the road I had already traveled. And as the highway stretched out into the distance, open and waiting, I understood something with a clarity that did not need to be spoken, that moments like this are not defined by how loudly they begin or how quietly they end, but by what they reveal in between. And as the engine hummed beneath me and the miles continued to pass, I carried that understanding forward, not as weight, but as direction, something steady, something certain. Something that could not be taken away once it had been seen. The road stretched ahead in a long, unbroken line, the kind that makes time feel slower and faster at the same moment, and I let the speed settle into something steady, something controlled, the engine humming beneath me like a quiet promise that as long as I held my line, it would hold with me. The wind pressed against my chest and shoulders, constant, unrelenting, but honest, and I leaned into it without resistance, letting it remind me of where I was, not where I had just been. But the moment did not disappear the way the landscape did. It stayed, not loud, not intrusive, just present, moving with me mile after mile, settling into the space behind my ribs where memory does not fade quickly. I replayed it without trying to, not every detail, not every word, just the feeling, the shift, the quiet line where everything changed without anyone raising their voice. There is something about that kind of moment that stays sharper than the ones filled with noise. The ones that rely on silence tend to echo longer. A semi-truck passed in the opposite direction, the rush of displaced air pushing against me for a brief second before it was gone, and I adjusted smoothly, hands steady on the grips, body aligned with the motion, because control is not about stopping the force, it is about moving with it without losing yourself. The sun had dipped slightly lower now, stretching shadows across the road in long, angled lines, and the heat that rose from the asphalt felt softer, less aggressive, like the day itself was beginning to release its hold. I thought about the officer's face in that final moment before I left, the way certainty had drained out of it without being replaced by anything immediate, just a quiet awareness that something had not gone the way it was supposed to. Not supposed to according to the system. Not supposed to according to expectation. And that was the part that stayed with me, not the stop, not the cuffs, not even the release, but that shift, that realization that does not come with instruction or training, only experience. Some people meet it once and never again. Some carry it longer. The highway curved gently again, and I followed it without hesitation, leaning just enough to match the line, feeling the bike respond instantly, no delay, no question, just connection. That kind of response is rare. It does not second-guess you. It does not measure you before it moves. It trusts your input and answers it directly. I wondered what the officer would remember when he thought back on this, if he would replay the moment the same way I was now, if he would feel that same quiet interruption in his certainty, or if the routine of the job would smooth it over, file it away as something minor, something that did not require deeper thought. People are good at that, at minimizing the moments that challenge them, at reshaping them into. My position slightly as the wind shifted direction, a subtle cross-current pushing against the side of the bike, and I leaned into it instinctively, correcting without overthinking, because balance is not something you debate in real time, it is something you feel. That is what today had been about, in its own way. Balance. Not between power and submission, not between right and wrong, but between perception and reality, between what someone believes they see and what is actually standing in front of them. The sun dipped lower now, painting the edges of the road in warm tones that softened everything it touched, turning harsh lines into something more forgiving, but forgiveness is not the same as forgetting. I thought about the words that were not said back there, the apology that never fully formed, the acknowledgement that stayed incomplete, and I realized I did not need it. Not because it would not have mattered, but because its absence did not change what had already been revealed. Some lessons do not require words to exist. They live in the space between actions and consequences, in the quiet understanding that follows when the moment has already passed. A car merged onto the highway ahead of me, its movements smooth, predictable, and I adjusted my speed slightly to maintain distance, not out of caution, but out of awareness, because awareness is what keeps you steady when everything else shifts. I wondered briefly if the officer was still standing there, if he had returned to the cruiser, if he had said anything after I left, or if the silence had followed him the same way it followed me. Moments like that do not disappear when the scene ends. They settle into the spaces people carry with them, showing up later when least expected, in quiet reflections, in small hesitations, in the way decisions are made the next time something similar unfolds. The road stretched on, endless in its simplicity, and I let my breathing match its rhythm, steady, even, controlled, because there is a kind of clarity that only comes when everything unnecessary falls away. The engine beneath me responded without question, a constant, reliable presence, and I realized how rare that kind of response is in the world beyond this machine, how often people hesitate, judge, assume, before they understand. The desert opened wider now, the horizon stretching further, the sky deepening into that late afternoon blue that feels almost infinite, and for a moment, everything felt aligned again, not because nothing had happened, but because I had moved through it without losing myself. That is the difference. Not avoiding the moment, not escaping it, but passing through it with something intact that cannot be taken. I rolled my shoulders once more, letting the last trace of tension dissolve, not forced, not rushed, just released in its own time, and as the bike carried me forward, I understood that what mattered was not the stop itself, not the assumption, not even the correction, but the choice I made within it, the decision to remain steady when everything around me tried to define me differently. And as the road continued to unfold ahead, wide and open, carrying me further from where it began, I held on to that clarity, not as something fragile, but as something solid, something earned, something that did not need validation to exist. The road no longer felt like something I was chasing or leaving behind, it felt like something I understood, a long, steady line that does not ask who you are before it lets you move forward, and as the miles continued to pass beneath me, I realized that was the difference between the road and the moment I had just lived through. The road does not assume. People do. And sometimes those assumptions arrive faster than truth, faster than facts, faster than the time it takes to ask a single honest question. I thought back to the beginning, to the flash of lights in my mirror, to the sound of authority before understanding, to the way a moment can be decided before it even begins, and I understood something with a clarity that only comes after you have walked all the way through it. Power is not always loud. Sometimes it is quiet, procedural, certain in ways that do not leave room for doubt. But real strength, the kind that holds when everything else shifts, does not come from raising your voice or proving someone wrong in the moment. It comes from knowing who you are before the moment tries to tell you otherwise. The cuffs, the questions, the silence, the shift, none of it defined me, not because it did not happen, but because I did not let it decide what I already knew. That is the part people do not always see. They see the stop. They see the authority. They see the correction. But they do not always see the choice that happens inside the person standing there, the decision to remain steady when everything around them tries to rewrite the story. And that is where the real power lies. Not in control over others, but in control over yourself. The sky had deepened now, the lights stretching thinner across the horizon, and the road ahead looked almost endless, like it would keep going long after I stopped riding, long after this day became just another memory. But some memories do not fade into the background. Some stay close because they carry something worth keeping. This one did. Not because of what was done, but because of what was revealed. That assumptions can be wrong. That silence can be stronger than reaction. That dignity does not need permission to exist. And that sometimes the most important thing you can do in a moment of pressure is simply not lose yourself inside it. I leaned slightly into the wind as it shifted again, steady, controlled, and I felt that clarity settle deeper, not as a reaction to what had happened, but as a direction for what comes next. Because moments like this are not isolated. They repeat. They show up in different places, different forms, different faces. And when they do, the question is not whether you can control them. The question is whether you can control how you move through them. Whether you can hold on to who you are when everything else tries to define you differently. Whether you can remain calm when calm is the hardest thing to choose. The engine beneath me continued its steady rhythm, the road stretching forward, and I understood that what happened back there was not just a moment, it was a reminder. That kindness is not weakness. That restraint is not submission. That dignity is not something given by others, it is something you carry, something you protect, something you choose every single time you are tested. And as the horizon opened wider in front of me, I carried that with me, not as something heavy, but as something steady, something unshakable, something that no flashing light, no raised voice, no assumption could ever take away once it has been claimed. And if this moment stays with you the way it stayed with me, then remember this: you do not have to become louder to be stronger, you do not have to prove your worth to those who already decided against it, you only have to remain who you are long enough for the truth to stand on its own, because in the end, it always does, quietly, steadily, and without asking for permission.